and welcome to Literary Hype. I am Stephanie, your LiteraryHypeWoman, and today's author conversation is a fun one that is perfect for the season and all the vibes that come with fall. Today I'm talking to Heather Walter. She is the author of The Crimson Crown, which is an evil queen from Snow White's origin story. So if you love witchy books, sapphic books, angsty books, you're going to enjoy this one. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Heather Walter. Welcome to Literary Hype. It's so exciting to have you on to talk about your book, Crimson Crown. So for anyone who hasn't seen this online yet, what's it about?
So Crimson Crown is a villain origin story focused on the evil queen in Snow White. And it is mashed up with the Tudors and very loosely based off the rise of Anne Boleyn. And it's got angsty sapphic romance. So all of those things wrapped up.
Retellings are really having a moment right now, and origin stories as well. So what is it about revisiting these classic stories that we all know that has really just hit the spot and become really popular?
I know that they seem to be having a moment now, but I personally think that retellings always have a moment, because when you think about fairy tales, the Grimm brothers collected them back in the 1800s. They went around and wrote them down. But the reason that they were able to write them down is because they had been retold for literally centuries. People would tell them around hearth fires, in the kitchen, bedsides, and every telling of that tale varied based off who was the one telling it. And it would also vary under the situation that it was telling it as well. So if someone's mom told a story that way and their aunt, something else. And so really those stories are all retellings, and the ones that the Grimm brothers wrote down was just the version that they got in that moment. And so all of these stories really are retellings to begin with. The other thing that I love about retellings is sometimes the reason that they would be different is because a certain lesson, they'd want to portray a certain lesson or talk about a certain theme or whatever reason that they chose. But one thing that I think modern retellings do really well is that they are kind of reclaiming these stories, because a lot of these stories that we're reading are very exclusionary to some groups of people that are just not in there. And so it allows us to present these stories with including some people that were left out of it, often purposely, and kind of give them new life that way for a new generation. And so it resonates a little more with us than these, outdated stories that were retold for so long, but they no longer reflect the world that we live in. And so it gives us a chance to keep them alive almost, and keep up that tradition of retelling and reclaiming and reforming these stories for the modern age.
So this is an evil queen from Snow White origin story. What was it about her that made you want to tell her story?
She's so interesting, and she's so cool. I think the Evil Queen of Snow is probably one of my first favorite characters. I just found her so much more fascinating than Snow White, because she had the mirror, which talked to her, which was awesome. And then she had the potion layer below the palace. She was just so much cooler than Snow White or any other of the princesses. Snow White cleaned. Cooked.
No one wants that.
No one wants that.
That's not princess behavior.
No. And so, even Sleeping Beauty's asleep for so much of it.
I would like.
Yeah. I guess sleeping through it, but still boring. Doesn't do much. Dark Fairy is so much more interesting than her. So I was just always drawn to her. But the thing that I noticed about her and about other female villains, and even females in history, were they are kind of boiled down to a certain set of motivations, very traditional femme motivations of being pretty, wanting a husband, wanting a baby. And none of those really resonated with me. And especially as I got older, I kind of thought, you are the most powerful woman in the land, and you're going to try to kill your stepdaughter because you think that she's prettier than you? That didn't quite compute. I understand it on a basic human level. We all hate that bitch sometimes. We're just you. And we can definitely have those base instincts and hatred, but when you're that powerful and you can do so much, the fact that she's fixated on that, I just didn't ring true to me. And so I wanted to examine some of these women and give them motivations that were not just these really flat, stereotypical desires. And I wanted more for them. And I also wanted to explore how they became who they were, or who we know them to be, instead of just like being this vain, shallow person their entire life.
With this story, you've been very open online about it being a bit of a struggle. So talk a little bit about why this was such a struggle and how you got through it.
Yeah, this book was a struggle. I wrote the first version back in 2018, and it's the book that got me my agent. And after you're your agent is the one who shops it around to publishing houses. And so it did not sell to an editor at that point. But during that time, I wrote Malice. Malice sold. And then after Malice Misrule Duology was finished, it was time for my next one. And so I wanted this one. So I rewrote it. That's where I kind of gave it the Tudor edge, the Anne Boleyn kind of, that's where I set it. And it did sell. But there was still something off with it. And I can always just kind of tell with my own work, like there's just it's almost a physical feeling where I'm just like, I know that something is not quite right here. And so I kept writing and rewriting this book for like 2 solid years. Definitely do not recommend. It was very difficult. It was really the only thing I worked on, which was another, like, really sent me towards burnout with it. Like, it was just the worst. But it finally clicked in July of 23. It is August of 24. So it was a whirlwind of rewriting it, copy edits, post-production. Like it was awful. But what finally clicked, I mean, I say it was awful. It was intense. I would do it again. I don't like to do things that way, but I would do it again. What finally clicked with me was there was a character that didn't belong, that was really holding things up. And he was just this sweet, charming character. I call him Alan because he was just like this good guy, but he just didn't do much. Not a Ken. Yeah, not a Ken. He's Alan. And I actually compared letting him go to the scene in Titanic with Rose and Jack, and she like doesn't know that Jack has been dead for a while. They're there on the door or whatever, and I also did not know that this character had been dead for a while, and then she finally realizes, and she just gets his little hand off her and lets him sink into the ocean.
How painful was that for you to like chop out a whole character?
Not really.
He's just Alan.
He was a sweet guy. His scenes were cute and charming, but like he didn't belong. And I think I was mostly just relieved that I had found one of the holdups. That was not the only holdup, but I was relieved to have found one of the ways and the freedom that I had to let the story grow now that he was at the bottom of the ocean. The other, thanks, Doran. The other holdup was, and what helped me was I read Story Genius, and I'm skeptical of craft books. I highly respect the authors who write them and put their advice out there for people to read. Very much respect those people who do that. For me, I don't personally believe that every book can be written the same way. And I think you do have to explore and find the right way to write a book. Like I have to find a right way to write every new book that I write. And so a craft book can sometimes try to dilute things into this is the way. And so I kind of I read them and I take the things that resonate with me from those stories and then I leave the rest. And so for that one, what really resonated with me is the focus on character backstory. And I realized that my main character, Eilith, had no backstory. She just kind of like appeared on the page. And anytime I said, what about before this? Oh, I don't know.
Which is especially troubling for when you're writing a origin story.
Yes.
It makes it very difficult to not have an origin story for the origin story.
Yes.
So that makes sense that it would be a problem.
It was a problem. And so once I sat down and kind of shifted some character relationships to make them more entwined, like Cassandra, the High Witch, in early or previous drafts, actually not until July of 23, was not Eilith's actual mom. She was just like the High Witch of the Coven, and they did not have an intense relationship the way that they did. So I shifted that. Her sister didn't appear until July of 23, who's a pivotal person in the story. So shifted those relationships, worked on that backstory, and with what happened to Eilith's past, just like what happens in our past, it informed her present and also her future. Not having one is kind of like pretending that you or I don't have a past. Like everything that has happened before us informs us where we are now. Coconut trees. Like we didn't just fall out of the coconut tree.
Exactly.
Yes.
No. So with origin story, you have a base that we all know with Disney's Snow White and like the classic tales that have been told. So when you're approaching writing this, how do you go about deciding what pieces of the original make it into your version?
Nothing from Disney.
Valid.
I say that for the litigious mouse who is always listening for me.
It's true, though.
For real. I did have someone straight up ask me, like, how can you write these when they're owned by Disney? And Disney doesn't actually own the fairy tales. The fairy tales are public domain, so they're up for grabs. Anyone can retell them. But we are very careful with any imagery or anything that Disney's IP. Like, for example, the name Maleficent, Maleficent turning into a dragon, like those kinds of things we steer clear of and kind of like come up with our own thing. So for when I do my retellings, I do start with, I look at the bones of the story and just kind of like the narrative arc of what happens and what everybody knows happens. But I like to take an inspired by take on it instead of the straight up, like, this is what happens, because then my characters can kind of grow into their own without being confined by the story. But I want people to recognize what it is, and so I like to put in like imagery or events that are for sure going to let them know that this is what the story is. So like in Malice was a Sleeping Beauty retelling. We did have a moment where the princess pricks her finger and falls asleep, that kind of thing. In Crimson Crown, there are apples everywhere. You've got mirrors, but my main character actually, with the evil queen, we know her as someone who's obsessed with mirrors, obsessed with her own reflection. But with this is an origin story, so I thought it would be cool to flip it. And she's actually hates her reflection and doesn't like looking at herself, doesn't like other people looking at her, which was great when I was writing her. And so I had that aspect of it, and then we had the Princess Blodwyn, and then we had watching Eilith kind of in the White Court, kind of seeing where this destiny, this momentum was taking her, that would eventually she would become the queen.
So in pulling from the Brothers Grimm stories, those are much darker than the Disney versions. And this book is darker than you would think for like a Disney princess origin story. So talk a little bit about how the grim darkness played into what you worked with and the vibe you were going for.
I mean, directly. And I love the darker vibe. And, you know, Disney will flirt with that a little bit. Like the scene where Snow White is running through the forest is super dark. And it's spooky. It's scary. And then the scenes with the evil queen are scary. You know, they're cool. And that's what I've always drawn to with the fairy tales. I was never one, like, when the birds come and, like, dress her and stuff like that, like, I guess that's okay and stuff. But, like, no, I like the parts, like, in the Cinderella when she opens the door to her stepmother's room and, like, you just see the eyes glowing. Like, that's the image that I have of that, where I just love that. So I always want my stories to have this element of darkness. And I feel like we're drawn to that as readers and as people. You know, we like the light, we like the happy ever after, we like the fluffy, but we are also drawn to that darkness as much as we fear it. And I played with that too, I think, in the book, with Eilith being afraid of darkness and her own darkness inside of herself, and really learning that it's okay to embrace it and it's okay that it's there. But yeah, I love the Grimm versions so much. They're so cool. Like, I think if you're listening, you may know the original ending to the Snow White fairy tale is that the evil queen has to dance in hot iron shoes until she's dead, which we could have a whole other conversation about. Like, Snow White is this like Disney princess, the singing to birds and, you know, just this overall good person. She goes from that to ordering her stepmother's death in this very horrific way. Like, that is not Disney princess.
Nope.
Yes.
I mean, and the way you brought that into the story was really cool, especially with that tapestry and like the way you described how that would look if it was made into a tapestry. It was really cool to think about, like, how to make those colors pop like that.
Yeah.
It's very cool. I appreciated it.
Thank you.
Yay, art.
Yay, art.
So there is a lot of magic in this book. So touch a little bit on how you craft your magic systems and build your worlds for these big epic stories that kind of have something that exists, but you're flipping it quite a bit.
I don't like to think too much in the nitty gritty of magic. And I think that's because I get really impatient and I'm just like, how does this work? I don't know. It's magic. So it works. So for this one, I knew I wanted, and the magic system is something that shifted drastically throughout. It was just kind of like the craft for a while, and they could do spells and stuff. But as it started coming together, I knew I wanted the witches to be very organized. And I liked this idea because they were celebrated and the covens were celebrated. And I thought if that was the case, then they'd really need to be organized. And if they're organized, then they're going to have different factions of what they can do because they kind of hone their craft in certain ways. I thought sometimes that kind of organization is helpful and sometimes it is not. And sometimes we start with an organization like that and it kind of like corrupts. And so I thought about what would happen. I imagined magic as a bureaucracy almost. And it's like, what would happen if they did organize all their magic that way and they did stick to that, because the emphasis is placed so highly on whether or not the spirits accept you, whether or not you're given this gift by the spirits, and where you are in your coven. And I think in the beginning, because it all started with like the ancients and how they sacrificed to form the bloodstones and save everybody from Malum, and that was very good and celebrated. But sometimes when we're chasing after or revering this thing that happened, it's like we go too far and we forget other things and we place too much of an emphasis on something instead of valuing the structure of something rather than individuality. And I think Isla feels that because she doesn't fit into this place that she is supposed to fit into, and she feels like she's not part of this big overarching community that she's supposed to be part of. And it pushes her to this other form of magic. And so that's what I wanted. I knew that there was going to be magic, the witch's magic. And then I knew if they had that and Alec doesn't fit into that, then we needed a different kind of magic. We needed the darkness. And so that's where Malum came in, which I picked the word Malum because it sounds, Malum is Latin for apple. And so I was,
look at you, so tricky.
Yeah. And then it also kind of sounds like this book that was published in 1486 called, I think it's called Malleus Maleficarum. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it basically translates.
Confidence.
Yeah,
you got it.
Translates to the Hammer of Witches. And it was a book that was used to describe what, like, this is what a witch is. And also, this is how you find a witch. So, like, in Monty Python, like, burn her, stick her in the water. She turns into a duck or something. I forget, all their, like, weird rules. It would have come out, not around that time. I think Monty Python was, like, 1100s. I don't know. Doesn't matter. It's Monty Python. It's whatever you want it to be. But that book came out in 1486. So, it would have been around and known and referenced in the time of Anne Boleyn. And so that's where Malum comes from.
And with Anne Boleyn, what was your research process like to find these little historical details and historical setting pieces to work into this story that you've also shared some of on Instagram?
Yes, I have. I had a large knowledge base because Anne Boleyn was one of my hyperfixations as a teenager. And so I didn't have to do a whole lot of like fresh digging. I've been obsessed with her for so long. And so I had a wealth of knowledge. The one thing that was new for me, I say new within the last like decade of my life, was the idea that she was not, her motivations were not as they are often portrayed in media. Because we have pretty much exclusive media representations of her of being the seductress and the homewrecker and wanting the crown just because she wants to be queen. And I would also argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing, because then we're kind of getting into the territory of like, what are women allowed to want, So even if that was her motivation, that's fine. But what's less talked about is like her charity projects that she did while she was queen, and she didn't have to do any of them. And her fight with Cromwell right before she died, where she was trying to pass the poor tax and actually help the impoverished, and that butted heads with him, and then all of a sudden there's a warrant for her arrest. Like, I don't think that's coincidental, So I wanted to play with this idea that she was not the person that is portrayed a lot of the time, or that historians will have us believe that. Of course, she lived 500 years ago, so like we'll never know like who she actually was as a person and what her true motivations were. But I wanted to play with that, and I did go to the UK in November. And really just visited like her home in Hever. I took my tarot deck with me to her home in Hever. That was really cool. I like did a little reading in her what they believe might have been her bedroom, because again, we'll never know. And then Hampton Court, where she lived. as queen, and then the tower, of course, where she died. So it was really cool to go there. And then I tried to just think about these little details about her life and slip them in here and there.
I was going to ask if you went to the tower and did the tour with the beefeaters.
I did not do that. I don't know if we had time for that, or we had been in the tower before, and I was just like, it's okay. It was so it was so touristy. Says the tourist.
It is, but it's like the best touristy.
It's creepy. It's creepy. I like it. I get really obsessed with my other hyperfixation is the princes and like what really happened to them, because I love how like history is pretty much just like, no, that guy was an imposter, and I was like, but it could have been him. Like, it totally could have been him.
But yeah, the beefeaters really do not like that the glass sculpture
Of the princes?
Of where the pillow for where they did
yes,
the beheadings.
Yes.
They really, really do not like that.
Why don't they like that?
They're like, oh, look, people died, and so we're going to put glass art there. So they were telling everybody in my tour group to write letters to get it removed because they don't like it.
What would they want to put there?
I have no idea, but they really don't.
They don't think it should be marked? Like, this is the spot?
I think it's more the, like, delicate, dainty glass pillow.
Oh yeah, the Cinderella pillow doesn't fit.
No.
I do have to agree with that.
It's very weird.
What else should it be, though?
That's a good question. Drop your comments of what you think should be the better marker for where Anne Boleyn and Jane Grey lost their heads.
Jane Grey, another hyperfixation. Like, oh, poor Jane Grey.
There's so many interesting historical figures.
So many. Yeah.
Girls need better stories.
Yes.
So if there's another historical figure that you want to work into another origin story, who would it be?
That's a good. I really like Katherine de Medici, the Serpent Queen, as she's called. Margaret Anjou, Henry IV's wife. Henry IV, not fit to lead whatsoever. So Margaret would lead for him pretty much. But she was hated. They hated her. She was foreign, and she just was not like, she was known as the Bad Queen. And she's known as a bad queen because, like, she's being a badass. Like, she's leading armies and she's ruling when her husband can't, and she's doing the one thing that a woman could do in power is to make sure that they have an heir that can lead, and that's like what she can do. Because it's very interesting that she never really seizes the throne and says, England is mine now. She's like, I will protect this for my husband and for my son, which is pretty much the main way. Because, like, we're still talking about 1500s women, you know, like, they're not fully modern feminists, which is totally fine. But just the amount of vitriol to her and how much people hated her for really doing what any other woman would have done in her position, and actually doing it so much better than any of them could. Because I feel like the majority of women in that situation would just, like, stand down because that's how they were taught to do. And she's like, no, I'm not going to. I'm going to make sure that we keep the throne and my son gets the throne. And it's what any man would do. Though they hate her for doing what any man would do. And I find her fascinating.
That is a really interesting story.
Yeah.
So without going into spoilers about this ending, emotional damage.
Yeah.
One of my coworkers was like, I need people to read this so I can talk about it because, oh my God, I need to talk about it. So touch on crafting an ending with knowing where you're going later.
Yeah.
In a book 2.
Well, you're assuming I know what happens in book 2.
Yes, setting it up for a book 2 without knowing what's going to be in book 2, but also delivering an ending that will destroy people.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting balance. So how do you approach that?
I just like to have these, like, big cathartic endings, and I want, especially when it's a duology, I have to go into it going, I want them to read the next book. So if I type everything up all nice and neat, like, who wants to read book 2? Nobody. So I like to end on these, like, really big, powerful notes. And we also, like, are talking about books as a transformation machine. So we have Isla at the beginning, who's, like, literally just, like, in this, wearing her crimson cloak, which marks her as a witch and part of her coven, so uncomfortable in it. It's like, I remember just this image of her with the buckle, like, climbing up her throat, and she's just like, oh my gosh, it's like literally choking her, the symbol of her power and her placement, to the end where she's not doing that, the opposite of that. And so I really wanted, knowing where she came from, I just wanted her just sloughing off everything rejecting everything that is no longer serving her, as we like to say, and embracing herself and her power. And so I got to a certain scene between certain characters, and I was like, oh, this is what happens. And there's just like a rightness that I feel. And I'm just like, okay. And that's what it's going to be. And it's going to be so cathartic. And they're going to see her do this. And they're just going to be like, yes, this is what it is.
So you'll just have to read to, and if you want to talk about it later, there's people who want to talk about it. Judging from what you said, book 2 is still being written?
Yes. We're having conversations about it. It's a tricky one. I thought after the whole debacle of, the struggle of writing book 1, finally finding Eilith and finding her hard, to be like, all right, book 2. Turns out she still doesn't want people looking at her. And so she has been difficult to pin down, to say the least, but it is coming. Not quite sure when yet, but there will be a book 2, and it will be, it'll be very clean in terms of, without giving too much away, it'll be clear. The ending will be clear. There is some, in previous series, there is some chatter about ambiguity, but this one is clear.
Separate from the book, online it says that you love to knit.
Yes.
I also am a knitter.
Oh, so exciting.
So what have you learned about creativity through knitting that has helped you as a writer?
Nice. I might have learned about myself, but I didn't really realize that until this moment. I like knitting so much because, like, you have your pattern and you follow your pattern, you knit the thing, and I love it. And I love, like, the repetitive motion and the just, again, the pattern following, and do the thing, do the steps, and you get it. And so it's like where creativity meets logic and order. And it's so nice, and it's just very satisfying. There's nothing more satisfying than binding off that last row and, like, looking at your piece and being like, yeah, I did this.
My magic power is to turn string into warmth.
Yes.
What can you do?
Exactly. I love it. But it's interesting that I never felt any urge to, like, create my own patterns. Some people do, and I'm just like, no. I'll be a follower of things. I'll get on Ravelry and stock it.
Yeah, I don't even do patterns. I do scarves and blankets.
Nice.
Because I will just, like, count off the rows and then just sit in a movie theater and go.
Yeah,
and not
movies.
think. Mm-hmm. Not, like, it helps me focus more on what I'm watching if my hands are busy.
Yes.
So there's always something interesting in, like, other creative endeavors. For, like, if you're a writer or if you're doing one creative thing, and, like, how you let your mind go with something else. I always find that interesting with different people.
Yeah, and I like to have, and I need to get better about having other hobbies, like knitting, gardening, or whatever it is, because I think it was Lauren Sebastian, I know, talked about it, but I think she heard it from someone else, that when your creative pursuit becomes a job, you lose, like, can very much suck the joy out of it, because there's a different kind of pressure that comes with that, and a different kind of expectation. And it's not just I'm sitting on my couch knitting pumpkins anymore,
100%. Yeah. Even with, like, Bookstagram, like, it's so easy to turn it into a job.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Nope, not me.
Yes. Exactly. And to care and to be visible, like, is the being visible hard for you?
Sometimes, I mean, I was TV. I came from news, so I'm more behind the scenes, but occasionally I would go do a story if it was something I cared about. So it's not as much with that. It's just I have given myself way too much to do at this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't do 3 jobs. It's fine.
I mean, I feel like I still have my day job. So, yeah, balancing.
How do you balance writing with a day job?
First of all, I have to. I will keep it until, like, I am the next, however much, until I'm rich, which is never, because, like, none of us get rich off this except, the 1%. It is helpful for my mental health because it gives me something else to do, that other people need me, and I have to do these things for them. Get to do these things for them, it sounds like. But it forces me out of the manuscript and, focusing on other people and other times and using different parts of my brain. But also, like, financial stability. Like, it is just so helpful. If I relied solely on the writing income, I would be so worried about, like, what if I break my leg? What if I need major surgery? What if something happens to our house or my car? Or. So it would just be really hard, and it would put even more pressure on this creative pursuit that is now a job. So it would take a lot for me to leave the day job. So in terms of balancing, I just have to be strict about my day job hours, of course. And my day job is done during day job hours. And then outside of that, I just always have to make sure I return to the page. But I'm also learning that when I'm sitting down and I'm like, okay, this is not working. Today is not a good writing day. I just kind of have to let it not be a good writing day. And sometimes that means I pivot over and I think about why it's a bad writing day and try to solve the problem that is obviously there. And sometimes that just means like walking away, because there's a lot of self-pressure to be like, okay, here I have this time to write. I have this few hours right now, and nothing happens. Oh, good job, you failed. And so I'm trying to take that off, because it doesn't do anything. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help the book. Like, it helps no one. So I'm trying to get better about that.
Well, the last question we always ask, because this is Literary Hype, what books are you hyped about?
Yes, I am finally starting We Were Villains, and so I'm excited about that. And I just, Kirsten White's Lucy Undying is coming out soon, and that is sapphic Lucy Westerna from Dracula.
Something like that.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry, guys.
Names are hard.
And so it's that, and it's gorgeous cover. Like, I want to hang it on my wall. It is so pretty. And then I'm reading Homegrown Magic, and that is Rebecca Podos and her co-author that is not coming to my mind right now, but it's cozy fantasy. I'd never really read cozy fantasy before, and I was like, I'm not gonna like this. I'm dark. I am spooky. I live in my gothic manor in my mind. Like, I'm not gonna like this. It's great. It's nice, and it's nice to be like in this fantasy environment. Apparently, they based it off their D&D group and like their campaigns and their D&D campaigns. It's great, and it's just like, oh, it's magic, but it's low stakes, but like it still has feels, and so I'm super into it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking time to talk about Crimson Crown.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Heather for stopping by Barnes & Noble to talk about her book, The Crimson Crown. And not only just doing this conversation once, we had to do this twice because the mics weren't plugged in at all. And I don't think y'all wanted to hear the conversation that was happening next to us. It was interesting. We'll just say it was interesting. So thanks to Heather for giving up double amounts of her time to talk about her book, The Crimson Crown. If you want to get a hold of this or any of her previous books, the links to do so are down in the description for you. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the Literary Hype YouTube channel if you have not done so already, and click that little bell so you get notifications every time there's a new video. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.